And a great day ahead of us here. And again, thank you for everyone for joining. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. And thank you for taking the time for joining the University of Michigan Press and Kochin and Michael Taylor and my colleague, Sean Manning, for the first of a series of author live talks. And the title of our talk today is We Are Now Friends with England and All of Mankind, Kochin and Taylor on Forming an Independent Empire. Let's get started. So the author live talk series will take place on Thursdays at 11 o'clock ETD. We're going to run these talks through June through August of this year. And it's the first time we've done this, so we're pretty excited to launch. And we'll continue to do these as long as there is interest. And it's really a chance for us to connect with the University of Press authors, and as well as offer opportunities for readers and faculty, librarians and media, and anyone else who's interested in our books and our authors to interact and with the authors live. And we'd also like to share with you the University of Press ebook collection, which all of these books are in. And we've been doing a free to read to support remote education and learning. A lot of universities are moving remote or figuring out their plans for fall. And this is free to read until August 31st. So all the books that we talk through, you can access and read only online. And we'd like to encourage your participation in polls and chat. And of course, as you know, as you entered this talk, that it is being recorded. And we'll make these talks available on our YouTube channel as well after the talk. So before we get started, we wanted to know a little bit about you all. That we have about 16 or so, 20 people here, and we're curious about our audience. This will help our authors and ourselves understand a little bit about you. So what I'd like to do is ask you to, let's see here, we're gonna launch the poll, and it's a poll asking you what your primary role is. So if you just take a second here, we'll capture your input. So it looks like everyone has voted, and we'll go ahead and end the polling. And we'll share the results here. All right, so we have, interesting. So a lot of us, most of us are actually readers, about 50%. That's great, we like to see that. And we have a small amount of professors and instructors, a couple librarians, and looks like some other prefer not to answer, so it's interesting. Does that help you all as panelists kind of get a sense of your audience? Lots of readers. All right, great. And with that, I'll go ahead and just introduce a little bit about the University of Michigan Press. For those of you who've engaged with us before, this may be familiar to you, but for others, we were founded in 1930, and actually this year is our 90th anniversary year. And we've been part of the library since 2009. We publish about 100 books a year and 5,000 plus to date, which is quite a bit. We've got some key strengths: political science, of which today you'll be learning a little bit more about, and performing arts, classics and archaeology, American studies, African studies, and Asian studies. We also have English language teaching, and we have a small trade list, which is mainly about the US Great Lakes region. And really core to our mission is a commitment to digital scholarship, including open access, of which you'll learn a little bit more about today. And just a sweet spot here on the University of Michigan Press ebook collection. All of the books featured in our live talk series are part of the collection. This is our first ebook collection that we launched in 2019. And it's on our Fulcrum platform, and it's an open source community developed platform, and it's developed by the university. And it supports new forms of scholarship. And what you'll find now is that a lot of our humanities and social science titles are also coming in with 3D models and audio and video and enriched images. And that's something that we want to support in those fields and disciplines. And of course, you can always read and download open access titles online. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists and then get them into their talk. So our first panelist, you could just raise your hand and wave, is Michael Kochin, and he is with Tel Aviv University, and he is a professor extraordinarius in the School of Political Science, Government, and International Relations at Tel Aviv University. And we have Michael Taylor, There you go. A visiting fellow at the British Library Eccles Center for American Studies. And he's there from 2019 to 2021. So right in the middle of a tenure. And of course you can, like I said, browse, if you see the link down there, you can actually follow along and read along as we go. And without further ado, I'll turn it over.
Okay, so I'm going to start, and then Michael Taylor and I will switch off. I usually call him Taylor, so I don't confuse him with me. So if I do that now, that'll be why. So is our big question in ways, is it most useful to think of the United States as a republic or as an empire? Are we to think of the principal goal of the early republic as to become a respected member of an international community, or as an aspiring empire whose lodestar in foreign policy was the desire to dominate North America beyond all fear of challenge, become the arbiter of affairs in both North and South Americas, and thereby separate the future of the United States from the futures of European empires and the European state system? In our view, America was and is an empire, a continental empire, in addition to its overseas influence and even hegemony. But America is an empire born out of unprecedented triumph followed by catastrophic failure. The triumph was the British triumph, ascendancy in North America and the world, that was confirmed by the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, and the 1763 Treaty of Paris that settled that war. For Americans, that's usually known as the French and Indian War because that's mostly who they fought. It was a global conflict. It was the first world war in some ways. And by the terms of peace, Great Britain won recognition of its East Indian enclaves, gained control of French Canada, a host of Caribbean islands, and the 2 Floridas on the Gulf of Mexico. The growth of the British Empire, however, had come at a cost. The debts and expenses of defending this transatlantic empire had increased enormously. Before 1765, the American colonies had been tightly bound to the British Exchequer, but British taxation of Americans was indirect, which meant that taxes were levied not on income or assets, but on exports and imports. When the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act in 1765 to raise money for the defense of the American colonies, it represented the first attempt to impose direct taxation upon the colonists. When news of the act reached the colonies, Americans protested that this parliamentary direct taxation scheme was unconstitutional because the colonists themselves were not represented in Parliament. And London, however, expected the colonists to pay up. The tax had been authorized by Parliament, which on their theory of the British Constitution was sovereign and able to tax Americans. Many at Westminster also blamed the Americans for starting the 7 Years' War in the first place, so they thought it was reasonable policy to make the colonists pay for what they brought upon themselves. The collective response of the colonists was to convene the Stamp Act Congress. The delegates reached the conclusion that it would repeat so long as Americans could imagine being British subjects. The colonists demanded no taxation without representation. Slogan is probably familiar to all of you. In March 1766, only 4 months after the Stamp Act came into force, it was repealed by the British. The repeal was a triumph for the colonists, proof that organized resistance to British policy could yield momentous results. But Parliament had not conceded the principle of its authority. The repeal of the Stamp Act was accompanied by a declaratory act, which reaffirmed Parliament's right to make laws for the colonies in all matters whatsoever. The principles of both sides were soon put to the test by the 1767 Townshend Acts, the 1773 Tea Acts, and the 1774 Intolerable Acts. For 3 years from 1770, there was a false peace between the American colonies and the Parliament at Westminster, but the Tea Act in particular revived and aggravated the different claims over trade and taxation. The act was originally intended as a bailout of the East India Company. It's a very complicated story I won't go into, but it would let the East India Company sell its surplus tea tax-free, free of additional tax in the American colonies. But the tea would formally still have parliamentary duty levied on it, import duty levied by parliamentary legislation. And so the act was perceived as an underhanded means of foisting further taxation on the Americans. When the news of the Tea Act reached the colonies, resistance was organized immediately, and that resistance culminated on December 16, 1773, when patriots disguised as Mohawks dumped 342 chests of East India tea into Boston Harbor. The British were outraged. In 1774, the British Parliament legislated 4 acts to suspend the autonomous government of Massachusetts and bring the colony under efficient control. A 5th law of 1774, the Quebec Act, demonstrated how the British failed to satisfy the expansionist ambitions of George III's American subjects. American settlers were drawn to the New World by the promise of their own land. When French Canada was ceded to the British, the Americans had expected that Western lands would be open to them, but the 1763 Royal Proclamation forbade white settlement to the west of the Appalachians. In the 1774 Quebec Act, much of this land was turned over to Quebec. London, it seemed, would stop at nothing to frustrate the ambitions of the Americans. Answering the call of the United Resistance, 12 of the 13 colonies convened in the First Continental Congress of September 1774. The Congress agreed to two measures. First, a boycott of all British goods, and second, a petition to George III for repeal of the Intolerable Acts. The petition reached London, but it was ignored. Within months, the crisis would descend into war. Now, I'm not going to give a summary of the Revolutionary War here. For that, you can read our book. But it has a masterful, I would say, treatment of the Revolutionary War and its diplomacy. America won the war with aid from France, Spain, Holland, and volunteers from all over Europe. Those allies, by sending supplies, arms, and eventually French troops and ships, helped the United States defeat British offensives on the North American continent, forcing the surrender of British mobile armies at Saratoga in 1777 and Yorktown in 1781. But the Allies had helped the United States for their own reasons. France to humiliate Britain, Spain to regain Gibraltar. The US would wind up, contrary to its engagements, detaching itself from its French ally and making a separate peace. The peace brought spectacular concessions from the British on parchment. Linnell, can you show the map of the United States in 1783 here in the screen view? Thanks. So you see it in a kind of double view. It gives you a sense as to what the maps will look like when you access them on Michigan's platform, Fulcrum. The maps in this book, I should add, were maps that Michael Taylor and I commissioned and were drawn to illustrate the book. We hope you all find them very useful. And some of them are actually quite beautiful. So what you see on the map is what the United States claimed and what the British conceded on parchment. Of course, the real story was a bit different. Michael will explain some of that, and then I'll come in later. But in practice, what's important to realize is that having refused to allow the British to create a modern empire in North America, the Americans had to address the problems they had fought the British to keep London from addressing on their behalf. The US had to open the West to settlement while appeasing and subjugating the Indians. The US had to open the world to their commerce and exports. The US had to create a fiscal system that could muster the resources of a continent and its people to repay the debts of the war they had fought while preparing for uncertain futures in a hostile world. Now, Michael, do you want to continue?
I shall. Hello, everybody. Given that the title of this talk really does focus on Anglo-American relations, I guess I'm the Anglo part of that. I'm in England at the minute, although you may tell from my accent that I'm from that wonderfully complicated and confused part of the world called Northern Ireland. I want really to begin by addressing the way that we describe in what's probably purple prose the situation of the US in the early 1780s. You're alone, you're exhausted, bruised, and battered. You have no real friends, and you are surrounded by enemies. You have no money to pay your bills, and you have scarcely the means to defend yourself. You have no sure way to put your house in order, but you have built this house in a vast wilderness of mountains, rivers, forests, jungle, and desert. This is no country for old men, no country for young republics. Now, if you changed a couple of words here and there, that could very well be a description of the place that Britain finds itself in now, having decided against what I would consider its best interests to leave the European Union. Linnell, could we go to the map again, the 1783 map, please? So from, there are, I think, in this part, I'm going to focus less in the book and more on a comparison between the US in the 1780s and Britain over the last few years. One thing before then, I would suggest that this map looks incredibly generous on behalf of the British. It looks like we've conceded so much land to the US, but one thing that we should remember is that lots of the Western territories on that map, very insecure. There's not much control over them, if any at all. The British are still there in their forts. The French and the Spanish are still where they can be. The Indians still control vast swathes of the American West. So what looks like a gift on paper is really quite a serious problem for a nation to solve. And now to compare this situation with Britain. Well, one thing is trade. You've all heard in the news, you will have heard in the news about the potential economic problems that will face Britain at the end of the year if we crash out of the European Union completely with a no-deal Brexit and without a trade deal. To put this into context, something like 54% of our trade is done with the European Union. The Netherlands, which is a small country, is our third largest trading partner in the world. And this is really essential to Britain's well-being. It always has been. We have been a nation of shopkeepers for several hundred years. Amsterdam is closer to London than the tip of the Northern Peninsula is to Ann Arbor in Michigan, where our hosts are. Western Europe is a very close, very integrated place. And of the 50 largest trading partners in the world that the UK has now, we've got trade deals lined up with 5 of them, which puts into context the difficulties that we might face this time next year. Of course, the States in the 1780s had a fairly similar problem. Everything that they had done had been geared towards trading with the British for the best part of 150 years. So every ship that left from Boston, every shipment of tobacco and cotton from the southern colonies, this was all designed for either the British West Indies or British Canada or Britain itself. And so suddenly in 1783, it finds itself locked out of the British imperial system. The French don't necessarily want to trade with them either, because the French had purely self-interest in releasing the US from British bonds. The Spanish were just about to collapse, and their entire empire was about to collapse. So who do you trade with? And this becomes a greater problem, because in order to fund the government that you need to govern this enormous swathe of continental territory, you need finance. You can't impose direct taxation for the very obvious reason that you've just fought a revolutionary war on that same principle. Indeed, the next time they do, the American government does try to impose direct taxation, there's a rebellion, small rebellion, but even so. So with no trade revenue, with no tariffs, you have a serious issue. There's also unproven leadership. Okay, Washington was a magnificent general, but nobody knew if he was going to be the ideal president. Nobody knew if anybody was going to fulfill the executive functions of the other departments with any degree of competence. And I don't know, Linnell, if you could flick to the next slide of the photo of the dear leaders of the Anglo-American world at the present. Well, you have to deal with him, and I have to deal with the one on the left. I'm not sure either's doing an enormously wonderful job at the minute. So, Britain, again, with completely unproven leadership, as the States had in the 1780s. There's also a lack of constitutional authority. So what is the government that you're going to impose upon this enormous continental empire? Well, the Americans spent quite a long time working out what it was going to be. The Articles of Confederation didn't work, really. And it took a very long time to persuade the various colonies to become states of the Union. This is actually quite similar to what will happen with Britain, because for 47 years now, European law has been supreme. If the European Parliament passes a directive, or if the Commission issues a regulation, that is the law in Britain. We at present have incorporated all European law into British law, and we're going to chip away. But how much do we chip away? What are we left with? What do we do with European court decisions that are binding, but we might not like? How are we going to enact or protect the rights of workers or persons from discrimination that were inherent in EU law, but have got no equivalent in UK law? So again, there's another comparison. The final comparison I'd like to make is separatism, because there is loyalism in the United States, and it continues arguably until the Hartford Convention in 1814-15. At the same time, Britain is going to face its own problems, because Northern Ireland voted heavily in favour of staying within the European Union. And the political identity of Northern Ireland is something that has been a matter of enormous contention for almost a century now. Scotland, again, voted overwhelmingly to remain within the European Union. And although the last referendum in Scottish membership of the United Kingdom was a decisive victory for remaining part of the Union, I'm not so sure that would be the result next time around. So again, major political revolutions, maybe they have comparable consequences across time and place. But in any case, the US does pass its constitution. It begins to do trade deals. And by 1794, it's begun to, well, it's certainly ready to possibly take a bit of a swipe at Britain, which Michael is about to narrate.
So if we go back to the 1783 map, this map was fine too. Yeah, so if you can give me the map with the Ohio country, that's great, thank you. So what you see there in the map that we commissioned, you can see the British forts at Fort Miamis, at Fort Niagara, some of them, in Detroit. The British are still there. Detroit is a city under British rule of 3,000 people in what's basically the far west. So the British are still there. They're not budging. And the US finally managed to inaugurate a government that at least had some potential to be effective in foreign and security affairs. On April 30th, 1789, Washington becomes president in New York. On July 14th, 1789, the Bastille falls in Paris. So French royal government, the principal ally of the United States in the big world, is now going through the French Revolution. The US is more alone than ever. And the issues with Britain are unresolved. The two sets of issues that are unresolved are, first of all, and most important, the territorial issue in the Northwest, and second, the trade issue, which Michael was talking about, because while the US depends on trade with Britain for revenue from customs, as Michael explained, that trade is not anchored in any kind of commercial agreement. And that becomes even more important once the war begins between Britain and her allies, and France and her allies, because that means the British are doing a massive amount of interruption of commerce, seizures. The French are doing commerce raiding. And all of this is not regulated by any kind of formal agreements between the Great Britain and the US, the terms under which the US will be able to sail the Atlantic and trade with the rest of the world. So Washington gets his administration in order. 1794, the US is finally in a position to try to work these things out. It's in a position in the West because after two failed Indian campaigns, which we discuss in the book and which were marked on the map, led to Harmar's defeat in 1790 and St. Clair's defeat in November 4, 1791, which was the worst defeat in more than 200 years of United States Indian wars, worse than Custer. The US has managed to build a third army at Pittsburgh, and that army has rafted down the Ohio and moved into position to threaten Detroit and to threaten the Britain's Indian allies. At the same time, the British have expanded in the Northwest. They've built a new post at Fort Miamis. April 1794, the British erect another fort, a new fort in American territory. So we'll get to the importance of that in a minute. At the same time, commercial relations, so the US thinks finally it has its act together to the point where the British will actually want to negotiate a commercial treaty with the United States, because the US, if they don't have one, then the US can start commercial retaliation on it against Britain. So they send John Jay, who's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, to negotiate, special envoy, to try to negotiate a commercial treaty, to negotiate getting the British out of the West, to negotiate the terms under which, during wartime, the Americans will be able to navigate the Atlantic and trade with Britain, Europe, and the Caribbean. But the Americans are perfectly aware that they may not get an agreement, that they may not get the British out of the post. And one thing the American elite all agree on is that if the British won't leave the post, in the end there will be war with the Indians for sure, and war with Britain if that turns out to be necessary. The British aren't budging because they feel a debt to the Indians. They want the influence of the Indians. Lord Dorchester, who's the Governor General of Canada and the last wartime commander-in-chief on the British side in the Revolutionary War, tells the Indians of the Western Confederacy in early 1794, I shall not be surprised if we are at war with them in the course of the present year, and if we are, a line must be drawn by the warriors. In other words, he's encouraging an Indian war, which includes a war against the American settlers in the West. Now, so what we try to explain in the book, and I'll say a little bit about now, is why, even though war may have seemed inevitable at the beginning of 1794, it didn't actually happen. War between 10, 12, and 18 years. Yeah, we'll get there, thanks. and the result was that Wayne's expedition defeats the Indians at Fallen Timbers. The Indians run away to Fort Miamis, and Fort Miamis does not open the gates. So Wayne has very interesting instructions. He's told to attack Fort Miamis if he can guarantee success, but he decides he can't guarantee success. He marches off to Fort Greenville and awaits a treaty, which he gets with the Indians, where the Indians concede in return for bribes a massive swath of land to the United States. Meanwhile, in London, Jay is actually able to negotiate a commercial treaty, which includes commercial provisions and a withdrawal from the West. So that's really, so they managed to get what they want from their new government. But the result polarizes American opinion between Republicans and Federalists because it's in fact a betrayal of France, right? The Jay Treaty means the US will collaborate basically in British policing, in British captures of trade bound for France. And that's highly unpopular with pro-French Americans and with other Americans who are unhappy with the administration for all kinds of reasons. And so American opinion, which was already beginning to be polarized into two parties, Republicans and Federalists, now becomes further polarized because the Republicans can paint the Federalists as traitors to Republican principles, and the Federalists can paint the Republicans as pro-French fifth column. So now, Michael, you're going to continue the story?
I am, and God knows if I can get through another 18 years of history in about 5 minutes, but I'll try. We've also received a prompt just to really touch upon what might be the key theme or lesson that you might derive from the book. And I think the idea really is that the first 30 years, 40 years of American history are not so much about security as about insecurity, that lots of the policies and lots of the decisions taken by American diplomats and politicians and generals are about securing American integrity, both politically and territorially and diplomatically, from a bunch of really quite hostile and often much stronger enemies. And that is, I think, reflected in the quasi-war. So Adams wants to stop French pirates, but he doesn't want to declare war on France entirely because that will bring down the wrath of Britain. And he doesn't want to sign with Britain because that will throw the United States into the arms of a Hamiltonian pro-British faction. The Alien Sedition Acts are signed, and this is again really a reflection of fear that French immigrants are undermining the Federalist vote in Federalist areas. From there, we go a couple of years later to embargo, and this again, there's this sense of naval and commercial inferiority because the British and the Royal Navy are willingly filching American sailors from American ships and impressing them into the Royal Navy. Good luck trading with anybody in Europe in the 1800s with blockades in the continental system. It's going to be incredibly difficult, and both navies, the French and the British, are stronger than the Americans at the same time. All the while through this is happening, there's continued Indian interference and British instigation of Indian interference in the West. I think most decisively with Tecumseh and what ends up with the Battle of Tippecanoe. So we get really to the end of the tether with Madison in 1812, and he declares war on the British. And we describe in the book with quite a lot of maps and quite, I think, compelling detail how over the course of these four theaters of war at sea in the south, along the eastern seaboard, in the north, around the lakes as well, how the Americans finally achieve that territorial security that they've been after since the foundation of the Republic. And it's only really, I think, whenever the news arrives from New Orleans and Washington, D.C., and coincidentally at the same time that the Hartford secessionists arrive in the city, that the Americans can say, not just to France and to Britain, but to themselves, we are an independent nation. We're secure now, both on the map, but also in the mind. And the British eventually give America almost everything that they want at Ghent. The book doesn't end there. There's a great deal more to say about American relations with the crumbling Spanish Empire and with the resurgent French monarchy in the 1820s. But given the Anglo-American aspect of this talk, I think that a crushing victory in the War of 1812 is quite a good way to finish.
Right. I just want to one memory from one of my trips to New Orleans. You go to the cathedral and you see all these flags, flag after flag after flag in the Catholic Cathedral in New Orleans. And I think the message there to anyone who comes in arms is that we, the Catholics of people of New Orleans, will obey the laws and pay the taxes of any new conqueror the same way that we obeyed the laws and paid the taxes of this whole row of previous conquerors. So we'll give you, you can expect that, obedience and taxes, don't expect much more, and you'll get what you expect. And Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans is the only successful defense of New Orleans in its history since its founding. Neither the French rebels against Spain in the 1760s, nor the Confederate rebels against the United States in the 1860s managed to defend what is a low-lying city where the river in many places is higher. You have a boat on the river with cannon, it's higher than the levees. It's really, Jackson was actually able to defend the city against the mightiest empire in the history of the world. So, you know, you can imagine the American self-satisfaction of that, even though the battle came after the war was supposedly settled by the Treaty of Ghent. So it didn't change anything in the paper terms, just in people's attitudes towards how the war ended and what it meant.
Although it is worth saying that it barely breaks a mention in British history.
Sure.
Because at the time we were defeating with Prussian and other allies what we would have considered to have been the mightiest empire at any time, which was Napoleonic France.
Right.
So we just focus on Waterloo and kind of ignore everything that happened in America.
Yes. Right. Now the Americans, yes, the history of American-British relations, it's a fun story. And one of the great aspects of it after 1815, which we only discussed briefly in the book, is that the British were very naive about what the Americans wanted to do to them, and to what extent America's rise would come at British expense. So this is where I think this point is one that is, you know, as an American, I'm an American expatriate in Israel. I've lived here since 1995. Yeah, I live in the 1790s, but I do occasionally realize it's not actually the 1790s. The question is, can the US survive as a large, diverse, but democratic continental empire? And I think today, these last few days, I think a lot of people are raising that question. To us, that's a constant question, right? The US was going to be big, it was going to be diverse, and its aspiration was to be a democratic republic, a republic with wide public participation, wide public control, wide public mobilization. And the goal was to dominate the continent, to prevent any threat to the US from the continent itself, which, you know, our book tells the story of how that position of dominance was achieved, which was not, it was a long and bloody struggle against people who had very good reason for objecting to it.
Kochin, guess what? The poll is coming along, and it looks like, I know you all have different opinions, perhaps. I see you vying for your sides here, but like 63% are saying yes. Oh, it just dropped to 56. So there seems to be a split audience. So
right majority, yeah, that's not pretty ominous if you think about it, right? If you think, I think that in 1990, it wasn't just the U.S. survival as a continental empire, but a new world order with the U.S. as the overwhelming hegemon. And now these old questions of continental security, which are the questions of our book, are in a way live questions. It's a different form of continental security than most of what we talk about in the book, despite the Whiskey Rebellion. But it's the basic question is the same. The basic question of, can Americans do together in the form of their federal government what it takes for them to hold together as a continental empire? We show how they did it the first time. And now they have to go on doing it under circumstances that are different and in some ways more difficult than have been seen in many decades. And so that's why I think the people here this morning in America may see it as more of an open question than would have appeared 20 or 30 years ago. But it's, you know, if our book has a point, a single point, our point is that it's always an open question. Sometimes the answers are easier and clearer in the circumstances of the day. Sometimes they are harder to discern. And today they look harder to discern than they might have 30 years ago.
There's no, like, Manifest Destiny was a headline. It wasn't a concept. It's not an eternal truth. And there's a hell of a lot of luck and contingency in the American success story, as there has been in any national success story. Bad luck may strike eventually. I kind of hope it doesn't, but it is open. So
we have a kind of a semi-outsider's perspective. Michael probably literally an outsider. I, who, for a variety of reasons, found myself spending almost all of my professional career outside the U.S. after going to school there.
Well, it looks like the poll ended up pretty split. I mean, we eked out yes, but just by a margin here. So, and that's only with 10 of 16 folks voting. So they're themselves.
All right.
Yeah. So we do have a question for you all, though, from
yes,
from the audience, and I'll go ahead and ask it. What was this your first time co-authoring a book, and how did you divide your work up in practice?
So this is the first co-authored project that I actually finished. I've been in the game for 30 years, and it's not the first time that it occurred to me to co-author a book, but this is the first time we got all the way to the end. What happened actually was I began this project a long time ago as part of my lecturing on U.S. diplomatic and security history at Tel Aviv University. And after working on it for a long time, I had a big pile of manuscripts, but I was dissatisfied with what I had. And in particular, I wanted something that had more sex appeal than anything I was likely to produce as a strictly academic author. And so I found Dr. Taylor here to take him on as a professional historian and somebody who has a much better instinct for commercial and entertaining writing than I do. Was brought in to actually help me finish the book with his research skills and help make the book, write a book that would have a lot more pizzazz, which I think we did. When some of his suggestions I understood and some of them I didn't. The ones I didn't, I thought were probably the most important. And so we implemented some fairly important suggestions of his, I thought if I knew what to do, I would not have hired this guy as my co-author. And that's how we were able to, bring this project, sail it in. That's my version. Now Michael's going to give his.
Yeah, so to explain by way of background, I finished my PhD at Cambridge in 2015. We started working on this book in 2016. I saw the ad online. I thought it was kind of a hoax. Like, do you want to write a book on 18th and 19th century American history with me? Yeah, sure, I'll do that. Since then, I've lectured at Oxford, and I've been a fellow at the British Library. I'm primarily an historian of the British Empire and the British Atlantic, and I've turned my PhD into a popular history book, which is coming out with Penguin in November this year. And I've obviously taken all of these skills and now pursued a career in tax litigation, which is the obvious and straightforward step. But in terms of how we worked and how we wrote this book, it was the case of trying to. Michael had basically written a paper on what became each chapter. And so it was turning that into a narrative from what was primarily an analytical paper. And this did involve a bunch of additional research, trying to find some interesting, colorful quotes, and trying to find there was an intellectual core to everything that Michael had written, but it needed the narrative drive, and I hope that I've been able to provide that.
Great. We do have another question, and this is coming from an anonymous attendee. When you seek to connect history with contemporary affairs in a book like An Independent Empire, how do you deal with the fact that the world is changing so fast around you?
I'm not sure that in writing that we deliberately, or at least I deliberately tried to connect what was happening to what happened in history. It may have been more the case that there are simply themes that continue to recur, and that whenever you're writing, it's impossible to avoid them. I know that we've deliberately tried to connect, or I've tried deliberately to connect this historical period with today as a means of exploring some of the issues that arise in the book. What I've done in my next book was about colonial slavery, and trying to connect that to what's happening today is a little bit more, that has happened more, I would say. In terms of given the length of the writing process for this book and how quickly the world has changed in the last 4 years, I think it would have been impossible to try to keep on top of the political zeitgeist because it's changing so quickly, I think.
Right. I mean, you know, I have a more academic focus than Michael, and so I see things a little differently. The world is changing, and we're training our students to try to understand the changing world and make some sense out of it. And the way that you do that in the university, one way you do that is not by directly trying to present them with the rapid flux of current events, but by showing them how the men and women of the past dealt with the rapid flux of events in their own time, using their own instruments, building up their own institutions and practices, clashing with their own rivals, opponents, enemies. And from that, they sort of see, I think, and you show them success. And the rise of the United States is the greatest success in the history of the modern world. And you hope that something about this case study, right, like they talk about in business school, neither of us went to business school, but case study like they talk about in business school, you know, gives the student some notion of what tools are out there to look at the world and figure out what to do, and helps them to do that, and also to develop their own tools, of course, outside. So it's not so much a question of applying the actual facts that we put in the book or the stories we put in the book, as showing how the actors in the book navigated the world that they lived in as a model for how, you know, people now have to navigate the world that we live in, which is, of course, as the questioner said, very different, and has very different institutions and very different problems. But the problems are still complicated. There are still a lot of people, some of them like you and some of them don't. And that hasn't changed. That's not going to change. And that's why, in my view, this kind of political history is going to be, is always relevant to people who want to understand how things are now. Okay, we have some more questions out there.
Yes, we do. Thank you very much, Michael Kochin. Bud Michaels would like to know, in both of your opinions, why didn't the United States pursue the manifest destiny northward to encompass the rest of North America?
I've two potential answers to this, because I'm only speculating. One is that, you know, Britain was beaten in 1815, but you were beating Britain with one hand tied behind its back, because it was fighting Napoleon. And 1815 isn't the British zenith. No, it's not until the 1870s that Britain reaches its probably greatest strength. It was really only the middle of the 19th century that Britain became the most powerful empire in the world, I would argue. So you know, is trying to invade Canada worth it? You know, they might beat you. The other thing is slavery. All right, okay, if you want to go far north, you're not going to have slavery. How is that going to affect the constitutional balance of the United States? You know, if you had tried to invade Canada in the 1820s and 1830s and succeeded, even though I think that's debatable, I think you might have accelerated the Civil War by 10 or 15 years.
Right. So what you know, as Michael said, what checked American expansion, I agree with that, was the slavery question, right? It was the Missouri question, the growing division between North and South, in the sense that any new territory acquired for the Union was going to join the North or join the South, and that meant every further acquisition of territory was very fraught until the end of the Civil War. Another part of it was you know, some of it was just they were defeated, right? They tried to conquer Canada in the War of 1812, and they failed, right? But another part of it, which also comes out, you know, in later events beyond our scope, in Mexico and so forth, but also in the War of 1812, the Americans were very ambivalent about war. They were very ambivalent about aggressive war. They wanted to exit the war system of the old world. They knew that to exit it, they would have to fight, right, which is part of the ambivalence. And they knew that American expansion on the continent would mean fighting the Indians. But the ambivalence was expressed in building a regime which in the end, right, is tremendously powerful when it can mobilize its people for its purposes, and utterly prostrate when it cannot. And so one of the key reasons the War of 1812 failed was that in New England, they simply wouldn't fight for conquering Canada. They just refused. People would not join up. They would not fight. If they had a choice between supplying the British Army with supplies for more money and supplying the American Army for less money or iffier payment, they preferred to supply the British Army, not only because of the money, but also because they didn't really believe in a war of conquest against Canada. And so one of the reasons the US stopped expanding where it did, partly because of the slavery question, is that the regime was built so that you actually had to convince people in order to engage in war. And the case for expansion, it wasn't like the French Empire of the end of the 19th century, where every captain realized that he was never going to be a major if he didn't conquer the next oasis in the Sahara, and nobody in Paris was really paying attention. And there was a little bit of Gwar and all that, but they weren't really paying attention, and the whole thing was done with tiny numbers of resources. The U.S. is not set up to do that. The United States does not have that kind of aristocratic imperial class. What they have is popular armies that rely on popular mobilization, that are staffed, that are commanded by middle-class people, mostly, who are sent to these military colleges by political appointments that are available to pretty much ordinary people through ordinary channels of influence. And you can't,
or in the British case, trade companies who knew that every piece of land they conquered, they had a monopoly over.
They had a monopoly on, right? So the Americans experimented to some extent with chartering these things, but the American colonial experience, which is mostly not in our book, right, has a lot to do with trying to find a place for African Americans in the big world, in Liberia, in Santo Domingo. These are not happy stories. They did not work well. And one of the reasons they didn't work well is that the American regime was really not set up to do these things very well. And so it's never been able to do them. Let's see if another question. Early in the presentation, you noticed the Patriots dressed as Mohawks. What was the significance of the symbolism? I think mostly it was deniability, right? In other words, it was a way of pretending that you didn't know who was doing it when everybody knew who was doing it, right? The leader of the band of Mohawks there, one of them was Paul Revere, who was a silversmith, a very prominent Freemason, a very prominent patriot. Pretty much everybody in Boston, including the British, basically knew who had been responsible for this thing. But if they dressed themselves up as Mohawks, then you could say, no, I didn't recognize him. No, I don't think it was Tommy. No, it was dark and they were all dressed as Indians. Who was it? Maybe it was Indians. I don't know. But that, I think, was, it was a costume that people could, it was recognizable that you were in costume, and therefore recognizable that nobody was supposed to know who you were. And therefore people knew, right? There's a marvelous book, Johnny Tremaine, which any of you who haven't read should read it. It's an 11-year-old's book on how to do political violence and revolution. Maybe this is kind of dangerous times to recommend it, but it was a book written for 11-year-olds in dangerous times during World War II. It actually explains how to do these things. And one thing that makes quite clear, and this comes up in the book a little bit, maybe not as much as we should have, was the revolution is accomplished in the popular mind by a shift in views. The shift in views is imposed with, as Johnny Tremaine discusses, with a great deal of violence. People in Boston knew at the time of the Tea Party, if you talked, you were going to be in a lot of trouble. And the message of dressing in Indian costume was, you might know who these guys are, but God help you if you tell anybody. You do not recognize these men. You do not recognize them. The fact you don't recognize them, but you better not recognize them, or the Indians are coming for you. These fake Mohawks are coming for you. Okay, we have some more questions.
Yes, we do. Taylor, did you want to take a stab at that one, or?
No, I think Michael covered it all beautifully.
Okay, good. And the final question we have so far is, do Michael and Michael plan to collaborate again?
I think that depends how big an advance Michigan are prepared to give me.
Oh, no.
That's great, yes. Yes, we'd be very pleased if the sales of this book would justify further collaborations. There are a lot of themes in this kind of imperial history, in the diplomatic history of the Atlantic, that would be worth going on to explore. But
sure, if the right project comes along and we both have the time, then
yeah. No, but we did enjoy working together, and I think we accomplished with this book. Certainly, I know that we accomplished with this book, something I would never have been able to do on my own. And,
Right. Well, with that,
And I was very glad for the opportunity.
to fund the Kochin and Taylor Part 2, we have to turn it over to Sean Manning, our publication sales manager, to talk about how to get this book.
Yes, thanks, Linnell, and thank you, Michael Kochin and Michael Taylor, for that very lively and engaging talk. As you'll see on this slide and on the previous, we do have a discount code set up at press.umich.edu for 30% off the book. And that code is UMEmpireVA, all one word. But you can also support local bookshops with your purchase. Third Place Books in Seattle, where the authors have done an event, has the book in stock. You can order from them online. As well as our own local literati bookstore. You can order through their presence on bookshop.org, which, if you're not familiar with the platform, supports is essentially an affiliate site for supporting independent bookstores. And as we have mentioned from the start, this book is currently free to read on fulcrum.org through the end of August. But if you want a copy beyond that, we do encourage you to purchase one either from us or from one of the local shops mentioned on the slide.
And copies for every single person that you know.
right.
And copies for every single person that you know.
Yes. Let me say it makes an ideal gift for bar mitzvahs or confirmations, as well as any other happy occasion.
Wonderful. Well, I don't see any other questions or any chats. It looks like everyone's saying thank you for the great presentation to Michael Kochin and Michael Taylor. Thank you for your time, everyone. I'm going to go ahead. These are the contact information for both authors if you want to reach out to them directly. And of course, you're happy to reach out to my team here. I'm at the press for further questions or about books or just anything about these authors and the lovely things they're up to. And with that, I'm going to close the webinar and thank you everyone for coming.
That's great.
Take
Thank
care.
you, everybody.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.